or were considered. Now, let's briefly talk about culture, and this will be quite familiar because we spoke about workplace culture last week. But I thought it's again a good idea to come back to how culture might now be a lens or a theoretical lens through which we engage in organizational analysis. So culture and decision-making theory really focus on the values, the beliefs, and even the practices that shape how organizations really operate. We look at whether there is a dominant culture or multiple subcultures within an organization. You remember that when we discussed about culture last week, we considered that workers in an organization actually might find themselves belonging to at least three cultures. And we might want to look at these and see how they are influencing things and how we can explain organizational problems using these subcultures. So we might also consider whether these subcultures are in conflict with one another, or do they work together toward shared goals? Because culture, as we said, can be a problematic element or a problematic feature of human service organizations. And as we said last week, culture can be quite explicit, like codes of conduct or those culture we know about the organization, but they can also be implicit, like unspoken norms and unspoken expectations. So when we consider culture, we are really looking at how culture influences communication and decision making in particular. So, for instance, if an organization claims to have a strong humanitarian focus, then the question might be, is that reflected in how people are actually communicating and making decisions? Or is there a disconnect between the values people state are parts of their culture and what happens actually in practice? You remember what we said last week, that sometimes people have, what they state publicly that is part of their identity, but actually when you look at how they are operating, you find that there might be differences or disconnects between what is stated and what is actually happening. So now, if we look at the Avalon case using the culture and decision theories, we might ask a number of questions. We might look, for example, whether in the case of the Avalon case, for example, we can see clearly that the organization began with shared cultural roots in mental health recovery. But also as it grew and diversified, different subcultures have started emerging, one around homelessness and another one around aged care. And these in themselves, they can suggest really different subcultures that might have different values, different professional goals, and different professional backgrounds, and even different ways of doing things. So when a new CEO with a corporate mindset arrives, that can in itself disrupt the existing culture. And again, when we are really analyzing an organization from the culture and decision-making theory, we are looking at what are those factors which influence the changes we are seeing, or which might be predictive of any changes in the organization. So this is really another important framework that helps us explore how culture evolves and how it affects both staff and clients in an organization. But remember, please, this is a very important and complex way, again, of looking at organizations. So, yeah, all these are key questions we might ask when we are looking at an organization from the cultural and the decision-making theories. So we can ask questions around dominant cultures and subcultures. How are these represented in explicit practices? What are some of the symbols, the myths and stories? And I think pretty much we had started looking at these last week. And it's very good that I see people already problematizing some of the workplace cultures they are identifying where they work. Now, very briefly, let's talk about postmodernism, which is And I would really talk about postmodernism just not as a theory, a standalone theory, but just as a set of theories and theoretical lenses, which again also might help us understand organizations from a different perspective. So it might be looked at as probably one of the most accurate theoretical lens that help us really describe organization as a collection, of different key elements. It's not really one singular theory in itself. So the key source for the postmodernism theory is Hughes and Waring, whom we started mentioning early on. And these people have explored postmodernism in the context of human service organizations. So I think there will be many other textbooks where you find postmodernism, but here we are trying to bring it back to the context of human service organizations. So postmodernism is just really a strand of theories challenging traditional structures and grand narratives. So the whole idea behind postmodernism is that there is no singular truth or no singular way of doing things. Rather, there is this openness to questioning and looking at different and even alternative ways of doing things. So postmodernism promotes diversity, flexibility in the way we do things, but also creativity. So you will see different schools of thoughts when it comes to the concept of postmodernism itself. You see key authors like Jean-Francois Lyotard, who actually coined the word postmodernism himself. Then you have a school of thought called deconstruction with Jacques Derrida. And the whole idea behind the construction is just that really need to start questioning everything and trying to deconstruct existing truth because we have this understanding that there is no singular way of explaining organizational problems. And then you have other scholars, including Jean Baudrillard, who suggested the whole idea of hyper reality, the idea where it comes all these ideas of real situation simulations and which really help us represent truth in the real time. And then, of course, we can also draw quite quickly on Michel Foucault's idea of knowledge and power, which again gives us, another lens of looking at organizations. So what I'm trying to say here is that postmodernism itself is not one singular theory, rather different theoretical lenses. And the whole idea behind this is that they try to challenge traditional structures and grand narratives. So postmodernism encourages us to really think outside the box and to break down rigid, restrictive practices. So in a postmodern organization, for example, boundaries are more fluid. And there is less emphasis on hierarchy, like we started saying in the previous strand of theories, and more openness to new ways of working. So this approach really is contradicting it's quite open to contradictions and tensions in different ways of understanding organizational problems. So, for example, rather than seeing conflict as a problem, a postmodernist view would see it as an opportunity to think in a new way, develop new thinking. And it questions authority, power, and dominant ideologies, including the very theories we've been discussing, like bureaucracy and scientific management. So postmodernism is kind of questioning all these in trying to build a new understanding. So in human service organizations, really, postmodernism encourages us to be flexible and client-centered. And this also takes us to asking us to consider how we can work differently rather than just taking things for granted. In a sense, really, we are building a way that's questioning everything we do and all the truth we might be considering in doing things. So postmodernism encourages us to ask a set of questions questions like, how does the organization allow for diversity, for example, in relation to work practice? What are some of the tensions, contradictions, and paradoxes, and even conflicts arising within the organizations? And how might those in typically less powerful positions be still able to exercise some power and authority within the organization? So you see, really, the question here is not to focus on singular truth, but multiple truth and many ways of doing things. Now, if we can think of postmodernism having in mind the Avalon case, we would consider, for example, identifying the dominant voices within the organization and, how this actually is playing out already in the case study. We might consider whether that's something which is happening, and who's being silenced, who's being marginalized, what are the core values behind all these shifts, the agency has been undertaking. So a postmodernist view of this case would encourage us also to consider how power is distributed and how diverse perspectives are either excluded or included in shaping the organization's identity and practices, and ultimately all these changes we have been observing in that case study. Thank you very much and see you soon.